The body keeps the score, and even more so in times of sickness and of famine. It's often said that the Irish attitude to the body changed fundamentally in the 19th century as a result of Jansenist influences exercised through the priests who came out of the seminary in Maynooth and who preached against the sins of the body. And this is one possible explanation. But those priests would have had more practical economic reasons for saying what they said, for preaching against sexual libertinism. The fear that the creation of larger and ever larger families would make family farm holdings unviable. The Great Famine, as we know, killed over 1 million bodies and caused the removal through emigration of many more. And the pictures and words about the 19th century tell us the story that from being a crowded, noisy, sociable, tactile place in the first half of the century, Ireland became depopulated, cautious, vigilant, and eerily silent. Because the people had lost their trust in nature. They had put their faith in it and it had let them down. So ever afterwards, they would treat nature, including sexuality, with a degree of suspicion and even of loathing. The very beautiful landscape, which once had nurtured them, now bore all the signs of disease and of ruin and of death. The great landowners, as well as some of the priests, saw the hunger as a method by which a divine providence was punishing a sexually voracious and degenerate people. And it was 50 years after the famine, the 1890s really, before the leaders of the Irish revival could rediscover in nature a source of inspiration rather than fear, and could overrule the fear of sex with a book like Our Own Grá Cúige Connacht, The Love Songs of Connacht, edited by Douglas Hyde. And a melancholy fatalism was replaced once again by a feminized notion of landscape in those songs. And you could decode the landscape by attention to minute detail. And it's in the 1890s also that you get the emergence of the strong woman of Celtic mythology as a counterpart to the new woman of the suffragists. In fact, Celtic scholars writing in that decade were astonished at the respect they discovered for the rights of women in the ancient law tracts. For instance, a woman could divorce a husband if he proved cruel or stingy or simply no good in bed, and she could be given her dowry back in consequence. This feminized landscape yielded up a lot of treasures and artifacts to archaeologists. So people began to realize that the land, with all those layers of past experience, was itself an embodied image of the human mind. And it contained elements which had been long despised and forgotten, but were still recoverable in the history of a national consciousness. And it's around this time that psychologists begin to notice many links between elements in fairy tales and the emerging practice of psychoanalysis. All that had once seemed repressed in the decades of Victorian Ireland can be brought back to consciousness, including a trust in the sacred beauty of all things natural, from landscape to the body itself. And there were vibrant debates, for instance, about what should be a national clothing, whether men should wear homespun tweed suits or women wear the flaming red dresses you see on the Aran Islands to this day, whether you wore Aran sweaters or tartan skirts. And this debate was a further illustration of the renewed awareness of the body as a kind of bearer of meaning and cultural value. In other words, if the land was being de-Anglicised, so also was the Irish body, by the practice of Gaelic games and by traditional Irish dance. Now, we know Yeats was haunted by the image of the new woman in the figure of Maud Gonne, and he was always asking himself what thoughts a woman had in a defining moment of crisis, whether it's the Virgin Mary in the moment of incarnation, Leda with the swan, or the dancer at the climactic moment of the dance. Yeats complained about the heroines of Swinburne and Morris and Rossetti, that they were basically men's heroines, men's version of women, with no independent, distinctive life of their own. And he wanted a deeper insight, so he composed, eventually, the Crazy Jane poems, in which he adopts a female voice, as he said, to make a woman express herself as never before. In effect, he's trying to give voice to his muse, the female dimension which brings him the inspiration to write. A mind can't create, he said, until it is split in two. And in his later years, Yeats associated all his creative moments with those instincts which make a man womanly or a woman manly. But that breakthrough had taken him decades to achieve. When he was young, he was an unconscious slave to his anima, which thereby dictated all his moods. And his anima, his feminine dimension, was embodied in Maud Gonne. He said later, "I cannot be just to any poetry that speaks to me with the sweet, insinuating feminine voice of those dwellers in that country of shadows and hollow images. Let us have no emotions in which there is not an athletic joy." So, the celebration of a harsh, monosyllabic will in the later poems of Yeats is his reaction against that early enslavement to the feminine. And this liberates the masculinity within. I think it's no accident that Yeats writes some of his most macho poems in the same years, which are also producing work in the female voice. In the earlier poems, by worshipping the image of Maud, he was in effect asking her to live out on his behalf a female element which he was suppressing in himself. He put her on a pedestal, but he asked her to do his female living for him. He wanted a Maud who would be soft, gentle. He was dismayed when she refused to conform to that image, when she actually voiced a relish for the hurly-burly of politics and a suspicion of sexuality.